This is Talking Mule Deer with your hosts Steve Belinda and Jodi Stemler. Talking Mule Deer takes you on a journey to learn more about the Mule Deer Foundation, mule deer and black-tailed deer biology and management, tips and tactics for hunting, conservation issues, and even features some of our corporate and celebrity partners. Now, let's start talking mule deer. All right. This is the first Talking Mule Deer live podcast, and we're going live for the first time. This is Jodi Stemler. I've got my co-host Steve Belinda on. Steve, how you doing? Steve? Did we lose Steve? We're going to be working through some of our technical difficulties here, folks. We've been practicing this, but this is all new. But we wanted to try something new for you guys because we have something that is going to be fairly historic in the conservation world, at least for my career, something that I've worked on my entire 20 plus years of work on conservation issues on Capitol Hill, and we wanted to celebrate that live with our audience and get a couple of folks that we have a tremendous amount of respect for and have worked with for a number of years on conservation policy issues to help talk about that. We're talking about the Great American Outdoors Act. The House is about to go live on their vote for that. They're working on one other bill. It was supposed to happen at 3:30 this afternoon, but they are wrapping up on another bill right now, and the next vote that occurs will be the Great American Outdoors Act. So again, I'm going to see if if Steve has gotten us on, and then I'd like to introduce our speakers here. Jeff, Steve, are you on? Whoever I'm talking to? Steve? You there?
Well, Jodi, maybe I got to take over as host.
There you go.
Today. Yeah.
Steve's apparently missing in action. He's there. I know he is. It's just our audio isn't working. So with that said, Miles Moretti, we've got you on. Why don't you give us a quick introduction? And then if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to have you be the one that introduces our guest speakers today who are going to help us talk through what this means from a conservation perspective. So go ahead. Take it away, Miles.
Yeah, I'm excited on both a couple of counts. One is the fact that we're doing this live. This is something new. During this COVID-19, we've had to just learn how to do things differently, and this is just one of those many things that we're doing different in this new normal. And so, and plus this historic day, a lot of good stuff has happened in the last year for conservation, and we're really excited about what's going on in Congress.
Yeah, okay. So Miles, do you want to give us an introduction, or do you want me to go ahead and make the introduction to Jeff and James?
I will introduce them because, for one thing, one of these gentlemen is chairman of the Hunting and Shooting Sports Council, and I'm on that council. So if you hear me call him Mr. Chairman, it's because he demands that. And but we're glad to have Jeff Crane.
He doesn't demand that.
The Congressional Sportsmen Foundation. And I'm not kidding you. These guys work tirelessly with congressional delegation at the federal level, the governors, the state legislators. I mean, a lot of what we're going to talk about today wouldn't happen without the Congressional Sportsmen Foundation. And of course, the leadership Jeff Crane brings is just amazing to the whole conservation community. So, Jeff, welcome. Glad you're here with us today.
Thank you, Miles, and thank you, Jodi. And I like hearing Mr. Chairman out of your lips, Miles. I don't demand it at all, but it sure sounds good coming off of you. But thank you for the introduction. Glad to be here. I'm actually sitting in my office kind of happily because it's absolutely pouring down rain, and under normal circumstances I would have probably hopefully been inside the Capitol by now waiting for this vote, but under the COVID we're not allowed in there, and so 2 blocks away watching it pour down rain and waiting like everyone else with the anticipation on the vote for the Great American Outdoors Act.
Yeah, it's probably a little disappointing when we've got something as impressive and huge as this on our radar screen, something we've worked on for many years, to not physically be able to be there. I remember on votes we had 20 years ago on this same issue that ultimately ended up not happening, but being there and watching it live is quite an experience. So that's one of those downsides we have. But thank you for being on, Jeff. And James, Miles, you want to give James an intro as well?
Yeah, I just want to give all those that are listening, there's nothing wrong with your audio. James will sound a little different to most of us Westerners. He's from Mississippi, and James is a great colleague of both Jeff and I's. We're both all three members of Boone and Crockett, and we've proudly worked together to help that organization. And James is, James, I never get this right, but Forever Mississippi Wild and group, and is definitely works on the policy end. And every time I'm ever in DC, I usually see James somewhere wandering the halls of Congress. But if there's anything you want to know about things like the Farm Bill and any other legislation, James Cummins is the one to go to. So James, welcome.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm here in my office with my dog Sika, so really glad to be on board with the first one. And Miles, you really couldn't have said it better, talking about Jeff and see it in the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation and how we all rely on their team in terms of helping us get legislation through Congress. And I have to think that the founder of the Boone and Crockett Club, Theodore Roosevelt, will be pretty proud today of what's getting ready to pass the House and being signed by the president. So it's a great day for us all, COVID or not. So it's good to be with you, and thank you, Miles, for all your leadership and what you've done through your career as well.
Yeah, thanks, James. And as you. I'm sorry, sir. And James has mentioned, he mentioned Boone and Crockett Club founder Theodore Roosevelt. James is also a regular member and chair of the policy committee for the Boone and Crockett Club. And Boone and Crockett has played an active role on both the Great American Outdoors Act here and also with the American Wildlife Conservation Partners. And the development of the most recent report that they put out, Wildlife for the 21st Century, which we will be talking about today as well. Probably as we sit here and wait for this vote to take place, we'll be getting into more details on that as well. But we appreciate you being on, James. Now, Steve was having headphone issues, so he says that they may be fixed. So why don't we see it? It's been nice and quiet without you talking, Steve.
I like it. I think we need to change the format, Jodi.
Steve?
He's still not.
Nice. We've got another little while. No, we won't give Steve a hard time there, and tease him on that. We'll hopefully get his headphones fixed and get him on board here. These are some of these technical difficulties we need to work out, but we will get him on. And in the meantime, what I wanted to do is start off, unless somebody had another idea of what they wanted to start with. My interest was to go back 50 years and talk about what the Land and Water Conservation Fund is. None of us were there when that went down, but we know what that is all about. And I thought Jeff and James, you guys have worked on this a long time and can give us a little bit of a history of what the Land and Water Conservation Fund is all about. So we get some context about then why this effort that kind of reheated about 20 years ago with the Conservation and Reinvestment Act, which did not pass, but the effort to get to full and permanent funding. So Jeff, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I'll start just briefly on that because I wasn't working up here 50 years ago, Jodi, but the Land and Water Conservation Fund was a really great idea that came about a long time ago, and essentially it's taking revenue streams off of offshore oil and gas royalties and reprogramming it back into this LWCF fund to be split between the states and then federal projects as well. And it's probably the largest single annual contribution just in the straight conservation funding coming really through a federal appropriations process until recently. And so over the years, I don't know what the total is, but it's billions and billions of dollars that have been put back into conservation. So it's a great win. And James, maybe you can expand a little bit on it. You might have a better background, or Jodi, I know you worked on this as well, but we can certainly talk a little bit after this about how this bill is changing that and changing the future of how this is going to work. So,
yeah, no, Jeff, I think that's a great summary. So the legislation was introduced and passed Congress in 1965, actually the year I was born. and as you said, Jeff, it really divides. 40% of the funds go to the state side, 40% go to the federal side, and whether it's funding access or lands that we enjoy hunting and fishing on, or a soccer field, or a baseball diamond in your local community. It impacts all of that. It is capped at $900 billion annually, and it's primarily coming from either off the Atlantic coast, the Alaska coast, the West Coast, or the Gulf of Mexico in terms of funds from offshore oil and gas drilling. And at one point in time, about 5 years ago, we were hitting about $2.5 million a day in leases from offshore oil and gas. So it's not funded through from a taxpayer standpoint. So we are tapping resources that are coming into the government coffers and actually putting them back in to benefit. And so sometimes people ask me, why would you support this? If you live in Mississippi, well, 41 states drain down the Mississippi River. So there's more we can spend some of these funds in the interior part of the state, the better off our Gulf of Mexico will be.
James, Jodi, James made a great point there. A lot of this conservation funding, when people question it, what they don't understand is there is so much interaction across state levels and across drainage basin, whether you're in the Mississippi drainage basin or the Colorado River drainage basin out west. The impacts are what happens upstream impacts things downstream. And so these kind of funds can help across that whole watershed and across the country in multiple states. So it isn't taking it from one place and giving it to another.
Yeah, so LWCF was passed in 1965, and the initial vision behind it was behind a conservation and recreation vision that public lands and parks were important for the health of the nation, and investing in those and using revenues from a non-renewable resource and putting them on the ground for parks, recreation, public lands, open space was a good investment of those non-renewable resources. It was authorized at $900 million, like you guys said. The problem was that it had to be appropriated every year by Congress. And historically, Congress didn't appropriate that. I think we only hit the maximum level, the authorized level of $900 million a handful of times, maybe 2 or 3 in the course of those 50 years. The money was supposed to go to that. It was dedicated by congressional intent, or it was supposed to be allocated by congressional intent, but it never went where it was supposed to go. So starting probably 25, 30 years ago, there was an increasing effort to get full permanent funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. At the same time, there was also an effort to get funding for wildlife to expand the existing Pittman-Robertson, Dingell-Johnson programs to get more funding for the broad suite of wildlife species that state fish and wildlife agencies are working with. That ultimately came into a bill called the Conservation and Reinvestment Act, which packaged a number of different things, including full funding for Land and Water Conservation Fund, funding for the wildlife agencies and coastal restoration and historic preservation and a number of other things. We got really close on that. That was the first issue I worked on Capitol Hill, and we passed it in the House. And then we were moving forward to get a Senate passage, and time just ran out on the clock, and we did it and didn't get it. But for 20 more years now, we've been sitting here trying to figure out a way to get full permanent funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So fast forward now to a year or two ago, Jeff, the conservation community has started to work on it on a number of directions, including access for sportsmen, recreational access, the Making Public Lands public concept. So tell us a little bit about how things have adjusted or expanded over recent years and why congressional interest has grown again since, about 5 years ago when LWCF celebrated its 50th anniversary. So
you mentioned the Making Public Lands public, and what that simply is earmarking $15 million or 3%, whichever is greater, of the LWCF funds to be set aside annually to go for access-only projects and primarily for hunting, fishing, and other outdoor recreation. So it was a way for us to really kind of unite the sportsmen's community behind the overall LWCF effort with a with a direct interest, because as we all know, especially out west, there's tens of millions of acres of public lands that are open to hunting and fishing and outdoor recreation, but they are inaccessible. And this provides a vehicle to try to use funding with willing landowners to create easements and rights of way and whatnot. So that created a bond that broadened that push in terms of LWCF when the broader coalition agreed to accept that. And 2 years ago, the LWCF was permanently authorized, though it didn't have any funding attached to it, but it took it away from the idea that the appropriators were going to be able to say, as Jodi said, how much money annually was going to get there, especially since we weren't coming anywhere close to that $900 million annually. And so this is the final step in that to permanently dedicate $900 million annually with the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act. So, in a long story short, by creating another mechanism to get the sporting community involved in the LWCF with a vested interest and other outdoor recreationists to try to solve some of these issues with physical access to federal public lands, this broadened that scope and I think really helped encourage a bipartisan approach to this. And we had a huge vote in the Senate with 73-25 on final passage. So fingers crossed. I think we're looking good in the House when they can finally get it onto the floor. So.
And let me give also just a little bit more on the making public lands public to explain a little bit of why that was necessary. It might seem obvious that you need to create recreational access, and in many cases it did. But the way the LWCF allocations worked, it was a lot easier. Projects that were bigger and had more habitat value, bigger picture for acquisitions, often ranked higher as a project that could get done. So often these easements or these recreational access pieces might just be small little pieces of land, and they wouldn't rank out as high as a larger parcel might in the scheme of things. So the ability to direct some money onto these seemingly small projects, but ones that will make a huge difference in the amount of land that recreationists, hunters, and anglers are able to access because of it, is a pretty big deal and gives those a higher priority. The other part I want to emphasize is that LWCF, as we've talked about, is often land acquisition, but it's not entirely. There's a big portion of it that goes to the state recreation departments or state parks departments and local recreation for local parks and recreation projects. Here in Colorado, where I live, there's a lot of that has been dedicated for trail development or trailhead access. For some local communities, it's playgrounds and things like that. So it's a really broad spectrum, and it does truly touch on a wide variety of issues. It will certainly benefit those of us who are public land hunters in the West, but it's going to benefit people on the East Coast who want a public lands hunt or need access, or even if you have or need a green belt in your community, this might be something that's relevant. Now, I understand, once again, we're going to try. Steve, have we got you now?
I'm back, baby.
Darn it! No, people don't know. Yeah, the irony is that Steve is also the keeper of the sound effects, so this could get real interesting now. But
I could listen to you guys all day, and I know I was leaving you in good hands. Plus, it also allowed me to go get find my little celebratory flask, which I plan on lifting here as soon as we pass this HR this bill in the House. So, listening to the conversation, I think if folks aren't getting the message, this is a really big deal, and just having James and Jeff and Miles on the call, and should reflect on how much investment each one of them individually, and Jodi, you and the organizations we've worked for and conservation in general has fought to this point, that we're not only going to get LWCF funded at $900 million a year with the access program that Jeff mentioned, but we're also going to get some deferred maintenance, $9.5 billion for deferred maintenance for federal lands, and I am a previous reformed federal employee for 2 agencies, and thinking back to my time in those agencies and how much folks spent, particularly managers and budget people spent on trying to address the deferred maintenance needs, and then seeing the needs actually out on the ground, whether it be a trail or a road or whatever it is. I'm so glad that's going to happen. And it's going to, it's really going to allow us to really spruce up and fix some of the issues that have been lingering out there for a long time. So I'm back. You got to deal with me. I've got the control panel here, and hopefully we get this vote started. That looks like they've
got about 9 minutes left.
Yeah.
Well, they've got about 9 minutes left on the second half of the vote that they were working on beforehand. But again, this one should not be extended because most of the members were on the Capitol for the first vote, and the same would go for Great American Outdoors Act. So theoretically, we're going to move on pretty quickly into that. And Jeff and James, I actually want to bring up that deferred maintenance piece because that was another critical piece to this puzzle, wasn't it?
Yes. And again, James, I'm sorry if I keep, just shut me down if you want to, but
no, Mr. Chairman, you're fine.
It was oh, thanks for that. I love that. It was the most significant part about that was there was a deal to have this combined bill work on the deferred maintenance on our national park system, which we all agree is extremely important. It's a flagship of our public lands, but they had left out a lot of the lands that we as sportsmen and women use, namely BLM, Forest Service, and the refuge system. And so as pre-COVID, but this spring, as this was starting to really get some momentum, we went to bat in the Senate at the time to really work with the champions of the bill and with the White House to make them understand how important it was to expand this bill. And at the time, I honestly didn't think they were going to add $3 billion extra dollars onto a $6.5 billion package, because billions were big before COVID, and now trillions, they throw trillions around up here. So the game's changed a little bit, but that $3 billion extra dollars that was included in the expansion to include the Forest Service, the BLM, the refuge system, and tribal lands is huge for the sporting community. Those combined lands provide 25 million hunting days and 45 million fishing days for American sportsmen and women every year. So that is a gigantic win. The overall bill is a gigantic win, but that access component and the inclusion of these other federal public lands really drives at the heart of what we as sportsmen and women were pushing for in a policy in the policy arena up here in the Congress. So feeling good right now. Waiting for the vote also.
They did just say that it just was on the thing that up next is this vote. So as soon as they get through, and like I said, they should not have to extend this particular vote because people will be close to the Capitol to make that vote. And so we should be seeing it here. There, it looks like the next vote will happen somewhere in the next 6 to 8 minutes, which will be ours. So we'll keep an eye on it.
So Jodi, just to expand a little bit on what Jeff was talking about, for folks who aren't familiar with how the federal government works, they work with appropriated dollars and trust fund dollars to do the job of managing our natural resources. And when you look at things like fire or deferred maintenance, there have been times in the very recent future that we've had to take money intended for the management of wildlife and use it to fight fire or address deferred maintenance, particularly in emergency situations. So what excites me about the deferred maintenance part of this is they're no longer going to have to go in and raid other programs, particularly resource programs, to get, things up to speed. And, that's going to allow that stuff to go back to wildlife, range, forestry, recreation, and that. And that's sort of a 1 + 1 = 4 situation there. And, I think it takes a little bit of understanding, or having worked as a federal biologist or federal employee, to understand really that this is huge, funding that deferred maintenance.
Steve, if James, maybe if you could expand a little bit, because what he mentioned is, it used to be when we had fires, a lot of the federal budget had to go fight that, but Another huge piece of legislation is what we call the fire fix, passed, I guess it was last year. And tell us how that fits into all this, James, if you can.
So very good point, Miles. So if you look at this year and last year, hunters, anglers, outdoor enthusiasts, us in conservation have had some pretty huge wins. I mean, it's been really, really good, and whether it's what we're talking about today or what you just mentioned, Miles, looking at the firefighting fix, we've got, 150 million acres or more at a high degree of risk of catastrophic wildfire in this country. And the fix that Congress passed last year, where they took mandatory monies to help pay for firefighting and reducing fuels out there on the landscape, primarily in your part of the world in the West. We've had 60 inches of rain so far here, so we're okay, I think, on the fire situation. Might drown, but we're okay on fire.
So pump it up here.
So really, what's happened, whether it be primarily with our national forest, as well as some extent with the Bureau of Land Management and national parks, Congress has really provided some very good legislation in the past 18 months that really helps us fix a lot of this. Bruce Westerman in Congress, he's a member of the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus, member of the Western Forestry Caucus. He's the only forester in Congress, took a real lead there. He really fortunate to have people with insight that understand not only how government works, but understands how forest management and wildlife work. And for that, I thank him. I want to mention one other thing too, and certainly, you can't go a single evening, or day without, thinking about our economy and we're thinking about COVID. And if you look at funding and what's going on, we're going back to when Ronald Reagan was president. This has nothing to do with Reagan, but in the 1980s, we were spending about 4% of our appropriated dollars in this country on everything to do with environment, natural resources, conservation, et cetera. And now we're less than 1%. And so funding, which went to the Forest Service, last year on the firefighting fix, funding that we're talking about today with the Great American Outdoors Act, really helps us move the needle and getting us back to where we need to be. If most people in this country have no idea that we spend less than 1% on conservation and environment of our entire federal budget. When we're trying to put people back to work, the outdoors employs about 5 million American jobs, or puts that many jobs out on the landscape, almost 800 billion in annual economic output, with about a 2.2% GDP. So we are part of the economic equation. We are part of getting America back to work. We are part of social distancing. Trails were mentioned earlier. That's a great way to get out and get some exercise outside of staying in your home and be able to social distance at the same time.
James, I think that's a really good and important point, because that's one of those things that the COVID-19 crisis definitely showed a lot of people that ability to get outdoors is so important. The ability to take a walk on a trail or to get into the outdoors. And for those of us who are lucky enough to live near areas where there are public lands, we went out a lot, as often as we could, because you can, in many cases, social distance out in your Forest Service lands out here in the West. And then you can also get on a trail and get out and stay healthy. So that was, I think, an important part of that, is recognizing how important that public land system, whether it's your local parks up to your federal lands, national parks, national forests, wildlife refuges. I think it came very clear. The other part is with the deferred maintenance, where we've had a lot of communities who have lost jobs during this shutdown of the economy for a number of months. These funds for deferred maintenance will be able to employ people on the ground in these communities that may have lost tourism income over this last few months. And I think that's an important part too. So there's people who are concerned, and I don't think all of us are, a little bit about spending, but this money is it's going to help jobs on the ground. It's going to help what Americans realized was really important, the ability to get outside and recreate in a time when we faced some of the more challenging circumstances that our country's faced in a long time.
Jodi, to follow up on that too, the trend is a lot of the state wildlife agencies are seeing their hunting and fishing licenses sales go way up from where they've been. Some of the retailers on another board I'm on, the National Deer Alliance, we have some retailers that are they're having some of their best fiscal quarters because people are buying gear to get in the outdoors, and you know, when the national parks were shut down for a while during COVID, the state parks were overwhelmed with people trying to get in, and they had to shut them down in about noon until some people left. They let people in, but everybody wanted to get outside, whether it was boating, fishing, hiking, whatever. And I think through all this, we're going to find how important recreation, hunting and fishing, and being outdoors is to the American public.
I think that's a really good point, and I definitely saw it here. In fact, walking just in our community, and we have several parks and green belts, and unfortunately, I don't live as rurally as I would like to at the moment, but we do have a nice green belt and park network. And I saw more people out walking and recreating during the shutdown than I ever have, and I'm hopeful I see them continuing to go out and get out. And I used to say when I worked on LWCF, these local parks are actually the kind of gateway to our bigger public land system. And if we're interested in getting more people recreating, getting more people fishing, getting more people outdoors, providing that opportunity to see nature and experience nature close will encourage them to explore it in a broader area and give them that natural experience and that connection there. So I wanted to take the opportunity because, James, one of the things that you started to talk about was the amount of conservation funding in the federal budget. And I think that's an important topic. And I want to segue a little bit for a little while. I think they're going to be starting to vote on here. The vote on the previous bill has timed out. They're going to get close relatively quickly here. They don't have that many more to go. So I think they're going to be shifting to the vote here relatively quickly. But let's start talking about the American Wildlife Conservation Partners and the most recent recommendations that they put together, Wildlife for the 21st Century, Volume 6. Because we mentioned that in that report, there is a mention of the decline of conservation in the federal budget. But let's go back a little bit and talk about what is AWCP. And James, your perspective from the Boone and Crockett Club is going to be important because BNC were the ones that initially brought together members of the hunting conservation organizations 20 years ago, right?
Exactly. And kind of forming coalitions and working together is certainly not new. I mean, we all know the quote from Benjamin Franklin: if we don't hang together, we'll surely hang separately. Well, back in August of 2000, Dan Pedrati, then the president of the Boone and Crockett Club, organized a really historical summit in Missoula, Montana, at the club's headquarters. We had about 35 separate wildlife conservation organizations there, from Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation to Mule Deer to Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, Ducks Unlimited, any number of different organizations. And certainly they have their own interests they represent. But what we've been able to do is come together, whether it be conservationists, professional wildlife and natural resource managers, educators, scientists, et cetera, working together and work with each other's area of expertise to not only develop ideas and initiatives that we need to be moving through Congress and the administration, but helping each other support their own initiatives that they're trying to get through. So by bringing this group, we're now at 50 organizations as of this year. Pretty significant partnership. Everybody works together. Everybody is pretty much works hand in hand with each other. There's no fighting. If it is, you're probably going to be asked to leave. But we really work
give
well
us a sense of some of those groups real quick, just so people can get a sense of who we're talking about here.
Sure. So you've got anywhere from Delta Waterfowl, Safari Club International, Pope and Young, the North American Falconers Association is a little different. The Wildlife Society, Rough Grouse Society, I mentioned Mule Deer, the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative, Wildlife Management Institute, the organization I work for, Wildlife Mississippi, Conservation Force, any number of groups all over the country.
National Wild Turkey Federation,
exactly.
Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Ducks Unlimited.
Exactly.
Right? Pheasants Forever. Yep. All of the major.
Yep. Yeah, all your major conservation groups that it's with a little bit with a caveat. You've got a lot of different groups that work in the area of conservation, but this particular coalition of organizations certainly believes in hunting and fishing. So that's a little bit what separates us from the rest of some of the coalitions out there.
So Jodi, I've got an interesting story about that. It's actually somewhat funny. When I was in Pinedale working for the BLM and I call them the deer and antelope wars, but we were struggling over how to develop the mineral resources and maintain winter ranges and long distance migrations. Got a call one day from someone at the Interior back in DC and said, I need you to liaise with the AWCP groups that are coming to town. And I was like, what's AWCP? What's American Wildlife Conservation Partners?
Who's that?
And I said, well, who's involved? And they said, we don't know. They said, but one of the guys that helped start it lives there in Pinedale. You may know him, Dr. Raleigh Sparrow. I said, oh, yeah, I'll give Raleigh a call. So called him and found out. I was like, whoa. So doing my due diligence, I had to report back to the liaison from the secretary's office. I said, well, here's what I found out. This makes up, all these groups, and here's who on it. And it was, the who's who, you've seen the pictures of and lo and behold, about 2 hours later, there was about 4 folks from DC that were coming out to accompany me as I liaised with AWCP on the anticline and the Jonah fields. And James, I don't know if you remember that one, but we stood out there in the beginning of the Pinedale anticline, and we stood there and looked at that 43-acre pad that had 9 wells on it. And we were going, well, is this going to be the future? How are deer and pronghorn and, wild places going to coexist with this stuff? And, it's led to 15, 16 years later, we're still working on that very question. But it really opened my eyes up as a federal biologist. And I think a lot of folks inside government at that time, particularly Department of Interior, that that this group was a very formidable group, a coalition that was looking to, provide solutions to some very complex problems. And they were willing to throw the organizational weight behind that. And, looking at the wildlife for the 21st century that came shortly thereafter, I think that's what's happened over the past 15, 20 years.
So go ahead, James.
Exactly. And that's one thing we are going to miss this year. Even though it's our anniversary as an organization, we're not going to be able to get together because of COVID. So and not have our reunion back at the Boone and Crockett Club. So we do this all by Zoom. So and that's always good to be able to visit with our fellow colleagues and learn about problems and how we try to solve them. And we got a lot of our conservation groups out there are kind of struggling through COVID. This was the banquet season, some of their fundraising season coming up, and they don't have that opportunity, so they're struggling. So I certainly encourage our listeners to support our conservation groups that are members of AWCP.
Yeah, well, we'll circle back on that one in a little bit, because I think that's something that we all can reflect on here. But I was interesting. I was talking to Tony Shonin, the executive, is he CEO of the Boone and Crockett Club?
Absolutely.
I was speaking. Yeah, he is now, exactly. They changed his title just recently. That's why I wanted to make sure. But I was talking to Tony, and he said, the interesting thing is that in August of 2000, when we pulled together that first meeting of what became the AWCP, there was a fire in the Bitterroot Valley. And he said the smoke was so difficult, it was so dense that you could barely see across the river. And he said the interesting thing is that 20 years later, we're facing our own challenge that's not going to be able to allow us to pull together. But in these times of crisis, in these times of challenge, is when often we get the clarity that we need and that we can work together and move forward on these things that we all see as an important issue for us to work on. So I think I found that interesting. It is disappointing that AWCP will not be able to meet this year in person on the 20th anniversary. I suspect you all will find a time to celebrate that in the future when we do get back to normal. But turning to the Wildlife for the 21st Century report, shortly after you guys convened, you came together with a series of, it was facilitated, you came together with a series of issues and topics that you thought were areas where you could get to work together on. from that came some back and forth and discussion, and the very first Wildlife for the 21st Century, which happened at the turn of the millennium, so that was pretty relevant at the time. And since that time, these reports have been made available to during every presidential election, and they sort of create a path, a general consensus by these groups of the issues of importance that you encourage the elected officials for 2 Congresses and 1 administration to work on during those 4 years. Is that correct? And can you tell us a little bit, both Jeff, because you were a former chair of AWCP as well, and James, give us a little bit of perspective on the previous versions and some of the things that came from those documents that we are seeing, chief among them, one of the issues we're looking at today on C-SPAN right now.
Hey, Jodi, before we get there, I just got to cut in and mention that Miles was also chair during an election year on one of these versions. So Miles, we're not leaving you out there, bud.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no, volume 4 was a classic. That's when I was chair, and
I think volume 2 was the best one we've
Well, Jeff, all I can say is you and I had Desiker to help us. These guys had to rely on Jodi and Greg Shieldwalker. So,
yes, which is why this is the best one ever. Come on now. For full disclosure, I helped the AWCP for Boone and Crockett. These guys write it, but then I tried to turn it into something that was a little easier for people to understand and read. That would be a report that members of Congress, Capitol Hill, and the public could look at for the recommendations and move forward. So these are all their ideas. I just tried to help it look and feel, with the help of Boone and Crockett Club's outstanding graphic designer, Julie Tripp, to make it look and read a little bit easier. So that's my role in it, and that's why I'm going to say it's the best ever. But of course, the ones you guys did were pretty awesome too. So tell us a little bit about how these kind of came about, the adaptation or the development over the last 6 volumes, and again, give us some ideas of some of the things that you guys included in those reports in the past that we have seen come about.
All right, James, you want to start or you want me to start on this one?
Hey, you go and start on this one and I'll back you up.
Okay. So, and Jodi, you know firsthand because you've helped us edit a couple of these now for sure, if not more. Trying to get 50 groups to agree on priorities and then trying to group those priorities into a series of recommendations and then trying to boil those recommendations down into a report that doesn't look like something that came out of a term paper at a university and actually somebody can look at is pretty challenging. And so the effort just alone in trying to get consensus on some of these bigger issues, and they're really based around a number of different areas that we're all familiar with as conservationists and sportsmen and women. And it's talking about funding, it's talking about access, it's talking about habitat management, some of the key big things that we work on, and some of them are directly tied to legislative efforts. You brought up the land and water conservation funding and backlog maintenance. I mean, these have clearly been efforts that Washington works at glacial speed sometimes, and it's been a long time coming to get to where we are on some of these. But I think that if you overlay wildlife for the 21st century with the federal advisory councils that got started in the Bush administration, were reauthorized and chartered in the Obama administration, and then again chartered in the current Trump administration, the backbone for the recommendations all come back to AWCP and all come back to the Wildlife for the 21st Century. So it is the way to get the major groups together to agree on certain principles and then to try to put them forward in a cohesive and condensed version so somebody can understand what we're trying to accomplish. And just that alone is that's a pivotal shift from before 2000 when the groups really were working independently to now where it's really coalescing around multiple layers from the Congress to the White House and the various land management agencies. And I think we're in a stronger position as a community of sportsmen and women through the AWCP groups than we've ever been before.
You know, what Jeff said about getting all the groups together reminded me of something that Trent Lott used to tell me about the Senate. He said, running the Senate's like pushing a wheelbarrow full of bullfrogs. Once I get enough in, 3 more have done jumped out. You know, so in all honesty, while it's tough to get everybody on board and supporting and pushing on all this, the thing that the common thread is these are all achievable. A lot of groups are pushing ideas that are not achievable. These are achievable. They're concise and they're very helpful to whether it's a Democratic administration or Republican administration or that particular party in Congress. So these have been very, very good as helping us kind of have a blueprint of where we want to go to help improve conservation in hunting and fishing.
You know, and if I could follow up, I had to check out for just a second, but I may have missed it. But one of the things we learned is early on, we used to give this to the administration after the election, and moving it to before the election and giving it to both candidates, whether it's an incumbent or in a lot of cases, 2 new candidates. If you don't get in early, it's really hard to get into their transition teams and the things that they want to accomplish in their first 100 days. And Jeff lives there in DC. He can tell you how important it is to get really early into what they're going to want to do in their 4 to 8 years.
That's right. And I think that these recommendations help to outline, and when it's seen and backed by 50 organizations, it gives them okay, this is a fairly moderate conservation vision that with achievable actions. And it's very explicit in some of those achievable actions. I think that they can take either as an administration or Congress can then pick up the mantle and move if it's a legislative vehicle that's necessary to move it.
And, you know, some of the early work that the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation did, you know, was, you know, identified about a third of all the voters or sportsmen in this country. 80% of our sportsmen are likely voters, and 8 in 10 actually vote their sport. So this gives them an opportunity, you know, going into an election to take some positions that not only benefit our interest in terms of hunting and fishing and conservation, but hopefully help be rewarded for doing so at the polls.
That's right. So let's do a little bit, if you guys don't mind, let's take a little bit of a look at what's in there. Obviously, Great American Outdoors Act is mentioned by name in there. We talk about the concept of dedicated funding. And this is something, Jeff, that I think I'd like to bounce to you, because we've talked about the Great American Outdoors Act. That's something that came together during this and will be a great win when they get there. I think they're getting close now. Hey, live, go for it.
So Jodi, you know, why don't you throw out where folks can find this? It's under.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, I think they're getting close. They have 18 people so far that have not voted in this final vote. So I think they're about to call it. They're probably going to gavel the vote previous, which means they're going to move into this vote here shortly. You can check on cspan.org. It's c-span.org. And look at the House viewer for the House proceedings, or you can just go to house.gov, and there is a link at the top that says Watch House Proceedings, and you can click on that, and it'll lead you to a viewer that you can watch the vote as it's occurring. Again, they're not quite there. They haven't gavelled on the bill ahead of them yet, but they're getting close. 17 haven't voted yet.
And so, Jodi, why don't you let our listeners know where they can follow along with Wildlife for the 21st Century, because it is a public.
Okay. Document. Oh yeah. Gotcha. So Boone and Crockett.org. It's boone-crockett.org. Has the report posted there. You can go and check there, and we have it all broken there by sections. Also, the American Wildlife Conservation Partners website, which I believe it's American wildlifeconservation.org is the website that houses that groups. It's mainly just the Wildlife 21 and the list of the organizations. So on the dedicated funding, the one thing, and I started off this conversation about how this is kind of a a watershed moment in my life and career, because it's something I worked on back 20 years ago with the Conservation and Reinvestment Act. One of the other components of dedicated conservation funding was funding for state fish and wildlife agencies. I'll leave it to the three of you guys, if whoever wants to talk about that. And then Jeff, you can also talk about recent House action on that and whether or not we have some potential for seeing some action on that still this year or in future Congresses.
Yeah, great. Go ahead. If you guys want to, James or Miles want to talk.
James, you and I started on Teaming with Wildlife, I think 20 plus years ago, right? That's where we first met. So do you want to?
That was a long time ago.
Trust me, I know.
and if you keep watching C-SPAN, it's going to be longer. So
yeah, right.
So it's, if you look at how, whether it's hunters buying fishing licenses or through, Dingle Johnson, that name sounds familiar, that helps provide, funding on the fishery side. When every time you buy a fishing product, 10% of that goes into benefiting fisheries conservation, or if it's on the Pittman Robertson side, 10% goes to of your purchases of hunting equipment goes to helping run those state agencies on both of those ends. So we're constantly working, especially as the states are suffering with tax revenue. We've actually seen a bump in Mississippi in terms of license sales because of COVID. But certainly this is going to help out the states, on the land acquisition side, as we see this vote move forward in this later this afternoon. And I know Jeff has been working on other pieces of legislation that will fund the states in different forms as we move forward. Jeff, you want to kind of hit on some of those?
Sure. So I think what everybody's talking about is something called the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, and that came about as a legislative proposal, really through Boone and Crockett, through the AWCP Wildlife for the 21st Century, but really coalesced into a broader initiative based on a blue ribbon panel that was chaired by Bass Pro Shops founder Johnny Morris and former Governor of Wyoming Dave Freudenthal, to look at this challenge of more and more responsibilities coming on to the state wildlife agencies, especially as more plant and animal species are proposed for potentially being listed under the Endangered Species Act. And so the effort was to find some dedicated funding. A proposal came forward. There's an alliance now created around this sole proposal called Recovering America's Wildlife Act. And the idea behind this was to put just shy of $1.4 billion. And then again, initially it was going to come from onshore and offshore oil and gas revenues. So it wouldn't be new funding. The funding has gotten a little changed during Congress, but the effort to direct funding back to the states in a dedicated account for species of greatest concern. And there are approximately 12,000 candidate species of animals and plants and whatnot that potentially could end up on the ESA. And that is not where anybody wants to see anything end up, both from a conservation standpoint or landowner standpoint. So this is a proactive effort to try to inject more funding into the states to look at these issues primarily. It has been a slog because of, again, the price tag was on it, and but we're happy to say that the effort got a big boost. It was passed as part of a broader transportation and infrastructure bill right before the 4th of July as an amendment to that on a voice vote. And so now Recovering America's Wildlife Act is out of the House. So unfortunately, the final vote was pretty partisan on that. So we're still trying to figure out a Senate strategy, but we've got it halfway out of the Congress right now. And, if we could pull the Great American Outdoors Act and then this one out, it would be probably one of the most, maybe the most historic.
I'm retired.
Certainly in our lifetime.
I'm done. I'm out.
So, these are huge efforts to put big money at real problems. Throwing little dollars at problems never solves them. And these are attempts to put some real money towards really addressing the issues. And again, originally the funding was already there. That took some turns for a lot of political reasons, but nonetheless, they're a 5-year RAWA. I don't like that acronym, but anyway, the Recovering America's Wildlife did get a 5-year authorization at one point, just shy of $1.4 billion. So huge win in the House also. So we're working the Senate as hard as we can. Our challenge now is we don't have a lot of legislative days with the national presidential election year. So we're going to see what we can do, but be sure we'll be back again if we don't get it done this Congress. So that's the way you got to work it here in Washington, is persistence. So
absolutely. And I'm going to just jump in here real quick because the vote has started on the Great American Outdoors Act. It is HR 1957 now. That is the Senate passed bill that moved over to the House. So anybody who is watching online or wants to, you can get a look at the vote tally as it goes up here. And one comment I did want to make, just in terms of the House process, because of COVID regulations, they are voting in groups by last name, and there's also proxy votes for members who are not in the chambers and able to vote as well. So I think that's some of the reasons why those two previous votes went a little bit slower. Right now we're looking at 66 yays and 69, 70. We can tally them up as we go along. Let me back up just a little bit and give, again, a little bit of a historical perspective on State Fish and Wildlife Agency funding, because as James mentioned, historically, Fish and Wildlife Agencies, Fish and Wildlife Management has been funded by user fees paid by hunters and anglers. Excise taxes on sporting arms and ammunition, as well as archery equipment, is the Pittman-Robertson Fund. And the Dingle-Johnson-Wallop-Bro, which adapted over the years, is fishing equipment as well as motorboat fuels and a few other things as well. And that has funded largely sport fish restoration activities. In addition, things like duck stamps, license fees, hunting and fishing license fees, permits. Those are the things that go to fund state fish and wildlife agencies. Most state fish and wildlife agencies receive very little general fund dollars from their state coffers, from state taxes. They're getting most of their funding from most of their agency work. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's somewhere around 60% of the funding comes through Sportsmen's dollars. So the idea behind Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which initially started with the concept of teaming with wildlife 20 plus years ago, is to provide an additional source of funding to these agencies so that they can deal with the challenges they're facing with all wildlife species and the expanded challenges as we face loss of habitat, things like that. Jeff, you mentioned species of greatest conservation need. That is a legislative term in how the states are addressing these issues. Mule deer in the West, in many states, are considered a conservation need. It's an issue, migrations, loss of habitat. So a lot of the Western states, this isn't endangered.
I think it's in, Jodi. Let me just jump in. I think it's in all of the at least the last versions that I've looked. Mule deer was in all of them as identified as they're the top priority or secondary priority for species of greatest conservation need.
Yep. So conservation of wildlife and management has gotten more expensive. Revenues from sportsmen's license fees have, in some cases, maybe not this year, gone down. So these are ways to augment what state fish and wildlife agencies do for conservation, hunting, fishing, bird watching, outdoor recreation opportunities. So that's what this is all about. So that's the conservation funding, which was priority one, recommendation one with the Americans, the Wildlife for the 21st Century report, the AWCP report. I want to just call out a couple of the other priorities that I think will be of particular interest, and just as a vote check, 122 to 51 at the moment. One of the priorities that is new this year that has never been in a Wildlife for the 21st Century is recommendation number 3, which is migration corridors. So I will throw that out there, Steve and Miles, to talk about how that came about, why that's now in there, and a couple of the recommendations that are included in the specific actions that are included in Wildlife 21.
Well, migration corridors really have always been on our radar screen, but not until really Secretarial Order 3362 signed by Secretary Ryan Zinke at the Western Hunting and Conservation Expo 2 years ago, really jump-started that with a partnership between the federal government, state agencies, and NGOs across the country. And, most everybody knows about the famous Wyoming migration corridors, migrations that you're seeing. In fact, some of the longest migrations in North America are mule deer, and they're in Wyoming and other states. We're finding the same thing. In fact, we have a cooperative biologist in Arizona working on migration in Arizona, and they've actually found a deer herd moving in a direction they had no idea where they came from. So more and more they're being highlighted, and especially with things like wildlife crossings on highways, and we're also, that's a high priority in funding in the transportation bill and other bills that are out there, is trying to get more money for wildlife crossings on highways. But yeah, it's taken on a huge high priority and lots of interest. And one of the things we're trying to do is a secretarial order can be eliminated, at the stroke of a pen by a new administration, or a secretary can decide it's no longer necessary. We're trying to get it institutionalized so that it's in policy, and Steve can talk to that in how the agencies do business. So that's a big push for us.
Yeah, Miles, and we don't want to downplay the role that you and MDF and those of us who've worked on this really throwing our weight behind this. When you look at the recommendations, a couple of things come out is where animals cross the road is great. And those structures are really expensive. And unfortunately, we hadn't done a very good job of coordinating with our Department of Transportations in each state, nor the Federal Department of Transportation. So that's come a long way. And also that federal state coordination, oftentimes there wasn't good enough coordination on when we're putting collars on the animals at the state level to get then the habitat and land managers to understand that they manage the habitats, and so how to coordinate that effort. So what the recommendations are really based on getting folks to understand the importance of this, figuring out ways to work together across multiple agencies and between state and federal agencies, and then really trying to find those management things that will work, and also the funding that allows us to maintain and conserve these corridors, whether they cross roads or not. And that's really being driven right now by the technology, the ability to put satellite collars and on animals to give us real-time locations, and then take the modeling that was developed, starting in Western Wyoming and being tweaked to the point that we can really predict where these movement corridors are, how many animals are moving through each corridor, and then, really the next step is what do we have to do to conserve and maintain these while we have humans on the landscape. We're producing energy, we're using the landscape, we're recreating on it more and more every time, and so these stressors all add up. And really what we're finding is some of these things are a lot easier to do than once you get folks talking. And giving our partners credit through the AWCP groups, those that have taken on the transportation aspect of this, and our state partners who have taken on really the lead role in trying to figure out where these big game go, and really bringing it back to what do we all want? How can we do this together? And what's it going to take to get us to where we want to go? And, we at MDF have, prioritized our migration and winter range program, and we've been able to secure quite a bit of funding for it. We've been able to partner with states to provide needed capacity, and we're also, looking to see what's next. And it's been something I've worked on for over 20 years, and it's sort of like, Jodi, you were saying that things you worked on long ago, you never thought were going to get to this point. When Secretary Zinke signed that order at the expo, to me, that was an extremely proud moment, one that I thought we wouldn't get to, because having fought some very nasty, controversial fights in Western Wyoming, had we had an order like that, things would have been much easier, and I think we could have avoided some of the controversy that came up about that. So, I just want to give Miles all the credit in the world to make this a priority. To, having been there, he and I have been working on this, Miles. I think it's going on 15, 16 years together. And, to see it get to this point and making it into the wildlife for the 21st century as one of the recommendations is an extremely proud moment for us at the Mule Deer Foundation. Yeah,
and Steve, thank you. One of the things that I did want to say, too, is since we've had that secretarial order, as I called Jeff Mr. Chairman, he's chair of the Hunting and Shooting Sports Council. That is a FACA committee with the Department of Interior and Department of Agriculture, and I'm the chair of the Wildlife Conservation Committee. And we've been able to also bring that up through that system and bring migration corridors and other hunting and issues that are in W21 directly to the agency heads and to in both those departments. And usually the Secretary of Interior and the Secretary of Agriculture are at those meetings, and we really are able to emphasize the things that are in W21 through either the Shooting Sports Committee, the Wildlife Conservation Committee, or the Hunting Committee. And so we really have a lot of opportunities to address these issues.
So just a quick update, we're at 186 to 63, 187, 63 right now in a vote. So we're moving forward pretty quickly to where we need to be just to pass it, but we're going to far exceed that, it looks like, hopefully, as all things and all word on the street is. Let me just read off real quick for you all what the specific recommendations and actions are. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but under the wildlife migrations, improve transportation planning to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions. There's suggestions about a passage of the federal highway bill with a wildlife crossings pilot program and a priority project list with state transportation and wildlife agencies for wildlife vehicle collision reduction and to improve habitat connectivity. So those are the two area specific actions under transportation planning. The other is under federal state coordination to establish a permanent program based on SO 3362 with assigned staff and funding to develop a companion effort. So SO 3362 is a Department of Interior secretarial order. So far, there is not a similar one in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Forest Service is increasing and Natural Resource Conservation Services as well. The idea would be to have a similar effort in the Department of Agriculture. And then a Wildlife Corridors grant program to provide matching funding for states and tribes for reconnecting wildlife corridors. So those are the specific actions. If you want to, getting down to the brass tacks of what does Wildlife 21 say, that's what we're recommending. That's what AWCP came to an agreement on under the big game migration corridor area. I want to move on to a couple of the other topics, unless somebody else wanted to just... Steve, if you wanted some closing thoughts on the migrations, Miles?
Oh, no. I mean,
I'm good.
Getting back to, it is a priority for MDF. It is one thing that I think we're making some real progress on. And if you want to know more about it, reach out to us and support us. Jodi, just a process check. Is it 218 when we know this is passed?
218. Correct. It is the actually total vote count to pass a bill at this point. We are at 197 to 65 right now. Yep, we are. My stream must be slower than yours up there in
and my internet's lagging behind you two. So I'm supposed to have like 5G or something.
Well, it's ticking up there, so we're getting close for sure. Technically, those of you who are watching it, if you are watching that vote, you're going to see that the time remaining is going to end, but they will keep this open. Again, it is a slower vote time these days because of how they have to group the votes. And because of the proxy voting that some people who are not in the chamber to be able to vote are doing. So they're going to keep that open until they reach their threshold of it looks like there was about 17, only about 17 or 18 aren't voting there to vote at all or not voting. So we'll hit there pretty close. So one of the other ones I wanted to call into focus, and we can go back and look at some other ones, was recommendation 6. For the Wildlife 21, and that is active management of federal lands. And I wanted to call attention to that because Mule Deer Foundation, through some of the work we are doing on stewardship, some of the big game migration corridor work that we are doing, involves active management. And I want to throw it out to Steve, the biologist, to explain and Miles, the biologist, to explain what we mean by active management. And James, you can provide perspective nationally, because I know you work a lot on timber management and the importance of timber management and active management for other wildlife species not in our western states. So why don't you guys give us an example, understanding of what that means to do active management?
All right, well, I'll take a crack at that, Jodi. So the stewardship program in particular is exciting because it was authorized through the Healthy Forest Act of 2003. It's been made permanent, and it allows us to enter into agreements up to 20 years long, which then specific projects or supplemental project agreements can be then done with the Forest Service and, to a lesser extent, the Bureau of Land Management. But it really is a win-win situation for both the agency and the organization, where we're able to go into areas and get things done that the Forest Service may not or could not get done given their priorities, their funding, their capacity issues. So we have a pretty large program. I think we have 16 active projects going this summer, but we have, I think, 20 or 30 that are out there, and some of them aren't funded this year and some of them are put on the shelf because of COVID-19. But we're talking about millions of dollars and tens of thousands of acres that would not be getting done unless the stewardship program at MDF didn't exist or existed. So it really gives us the ability to go out, work with partners. There's an 80-20 match requirement. So for any project, 20% of the total cost of the project has to be brought to the table from the partner. So MDF in this case would provide the 20%, and it allows us to really, get things done that the Forest Service can't get done right now. And so we've got quite a few projects in the West. We have a very strong program led by Kevin Zeman out in California. And the Colorado, Utah Southwest is led by Stan Baker out of Utah. And those guys are awesome. And they know how to get this stuff done. They know how to work with the Forest Service and our other partners to get, identify the projects, put out a plan of work, and then go find partners and leverage Miles to support those things. And it all ultimately, we're putting probably conservatively 10,000 additional acres of habitat improvements on the ground every year. And when you think about what deer need, succession and lack of active management can lead to situations both in our rangelands and in our forest lands that animals don't have what they need to survive, whether it be food, whether it be shelter, whether it be water in some cases. And so we go into these priority areas and we work with the agency biologists, and oftentimes the states are there as advisors and partners in projects to do things that deer need. It may be reducing juniper in a sagebrush rangeland to reduce fire risk, or it may be opening up the canopy through a commercial thin or a pre-commercial thin, or it may be
Steve,
going.
Can I interrupt you and just tell you we hit 218? So
yeah, great.
For the finish line. Sorry,
but we're gonna.
You can talk about juniper and thinning again. That's perfect.
We want to see it bigger. We want bigger numbers. We want to show how.
It's going to go bigger than that.
So Jodi should know that to throw the microphone my way on something that I know I'm very passionate about.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just thought it was important to flag that we had crossed the threshold.
We crossed the threshold.
Yeah, Jeff, talk about. All we hear about is how split Congress is. When you look at this vote, and it's still more Democrats and Republicans voted for it, but it's amazing how partisan or nonpartisan conservation legislation is. It just blows me away.
Yeah, we always talk about how partisan Washington is, not just the Congress, but the administration. And having worked up here, started in here in the early 80s on Capitol Hill and took a long hiatus away, but back here again, it really has been very divisive up here, and fingers can be pointed at any direction as to why. But starting with the passage of S47, the John Dingell Conservation Act at the beginning of this Congress, picking up on the forestry stuff that James mentioned, the target practice and marksmanship bill that passed last year, the provision to allow for funding for the Council for Advancement in Hunting and Shooting Sports and the R3 efforts, passage in the Senate of the ACE Act, the passage of the House of the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, now Great American Outdoors Act. There is only one thing that's unifying all of that, and that's conservation and the outdoor heritage. And I just think it speaks volumes to what we can get done if we pull together, if we check the partisan baggage, if we check our own hats at the door for our individual organizations and just work for what we all deeply care about. And this is huge. And so I wish I could figure out exactly what that secret sauce is, but we're going to keep plugging and keep hoping that that these themes resonate and that we continue to get bipartisan votes. And we've got a Republican-controlled Senate and a Democrat-controlled House, and this Congress is setting itself up to go down as one of the greatest conservation Congresses in our lifetime. And so we just got to keep piling it on while we can. I don't know what the secret really is, so we're going to keep trying it, though.
Jeff and James, this has got to be the last couple of years have got to rival the early 70s, right? With some of the legislation that passed. I think you can rank it up there with endangered species and all the other acts that passed, back then. Maybe even greater. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's what I mean. It's a lifetime ago since there was this much emphasis on environment and conservation, and so that is not a small feat. And everybody that's worked on this ought to really celebrate and rejoice and feel good about it. And hopefully, we're leaving things better for the next generation than we found it, which is always part of our mantra. And so I'm ecstatic right now that this thing has gotten over the 218. I can tell you that much.
If you go back into the 80s, 1980s, we were cutting a lot of timber in this country, and then the pendulum swung the other way, and we were almost cutting. Very little timber came off public lands. And you had great outcries about anti-cutting and all of that. But I really think things are moving back toward the center. We saw the forest legislation last year. We're seeing a lot more support, for active forest management. People recognize that if we manage our forests correctly, they're better for mule deer, they're better for elk, they're better for whitetails. We sell more hunting licenses, more money goes back to state wildlife agencies. We're reducing fuel loads out. We're reducing the amount we're spending in terms of wildfires. We're sequestering carbon, helping with climate change, a huge number of benefits from active forest management. And so I'm seeing even that getting a lot more bipartisan and working across the aisle to help advance forest conservation goals in the Congress.
Well, James, you're exactly right. That's why we're just accelerating what we're doing out in California with our program out there. Is they got tired of whole towns burning up and and fighting fires all the time. And even though we're having lots of other fires around the West right now, people are getting tired of that and the amount of money and resources. And now we're really, really starting to lose a lot of homes and hitting towns and stuff. And so you're seeing that pendulum swing back to active forest management. And we've learned how to do things better today, too.
And Miles, you were talking about, and certainly, Mule Deer Foundation deserves great credit, for migration corridors. And one of the things I think it will stick is it's based on science. And that's what a lot of us in the American Wildlife Conservation Partners are. Our backbone is science. And I think the more we stick with science, the better off we are and the longer staying power we'll have with policies.
Yeah, you're right.
So I'm going to, real quick, I'm looking at 250 to 80. Obviously, our internet services are all different, so it's probably farther along on your computer screens, but we are clearly in a very high majority, and it has passed. I do want to just make a comment to all of anybody who's a regular listener of the Mule Deer Foundation podcast. You all know that Steve and I really try to stick to that 30 to 45 minute podcast. We try to get that average daily commute timing down. And that was our intention today, for sure, was to not be having to talk. But this is a great conversation. The vote's still going. So we're going to keep going on. For our speakers, obviously, for you guys, if you need to go as well, that is understandable as well. But we're going to stay on here until this vote goes through and is finalized. We still have a number of things on the Wildlife 21 we can be talking about in the meantime. But I just wanted to flag that out there. Obviously, those of you who listen to us know we try not to be that long term, and it just by necessity this time we are going longer than usual. But hopefully you're learning out of this. I hope you're getting some good information and seeing the hard work that groups like Mule Deer Foundation, Congressional Sportsmen Foundation, Boone and Crockett Club, Wildlife Mississippi, and a number of other groups are doing on your behalf. And that's, I guess, again, I want to segue back to the report, but the point of that is policy's messy, policy's ugly. It takes a lot of time to explain and understand and get the connection to it. But policy is essential to what we do when we're out in the great outdoors. We want to know that groups like CSF and Mule Deer and others are working on these issues so that you're looking out for our best interests. And I think that's an important part. A lot of people like to say, oh, wonder why you get involved in them in the first place. But these days, this is why we do this.
Yeah.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
Good. So again, active management. Oh, go ahead, Jeff. I'm sorry.
I just say 20 years of work, and guys, I do have to bail. I really appreciate being able to join you, Jodi and Steve, and thank you to my colleagues and Miles and James, and got some quick follow up stuff with the Hill here that I got to jump on, but. The timing of this was great, and I hope everybody takes a victory lap, and because we all deserve it, and look forward to the president signing this into law. But thank you for having me, and look forward to joining you guys sometime soon.
Well, thank you, Jeff. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for your leadership, Jeff. Yeah,
you bet. See you guys. Take care.
Bye. Congratulations. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you.
So yes, this is historic, and I don't think we've actually said this, but it is expected to get signed into law. There are bills that get passed by both chambers that don't, but the president has said he will sign this. This is passage in the House means it's going to go straight to they're voting on the same bill that passed out of the Senate. So they do not need to go to a conference committee because the text of the bill is exactly the same. So it will go to the president with no other stops, and he is expected to be signing this legislation. I'm not sure exactly when. I would like to think and hope that some of our community might be invited to that signing. Well, they probably won't do signing ceremonies anymore.
Well, Jodi, going back to Schoolhouse Rock, he has 7 days to sign or something like that? Thinking back to our civics.
Bill, and he's up on Capitol Hill, and I suspect that will be happening expeditiously. He is well aware of this bill. The administration has been supporting it and saying that this is a priority for them as well. So I'm at 265 to 92. So talk about.
I'm at 270. So we passed that next threshold. So.
Yeah, it's almost veto proof. So.
Yep.
It just became veto proof. 269 is veto proof.
Well, people can always change their vote later, but so.
Yep. Yeah. So circling back on the active management, did either of you guys want to, any of you folks want to talk a little bit more about what was in the report on that?
Well, have James talk about that, because he's heavily involved in active management of forests, both in the South and as part of the Boone and Crockett Club.
Yeah. So you guys hit a good bit on, on the West, here in the southeastern United States, we're looking at either, our forest types are either bottomland hardwoods or, upland hardwoods and mixed shortleaf pine or longleaf pine. And getting back in and being able to thin these forests for a variety of forest products, being able to open that canopy up or put some sunlight on the ground, as we say, put some groceries on the ground for deer. That's a lot of what we spend a lot of time working on. Invasive species control, whether it be kudzu or kogon grass, or probably a lot of things, Miles, you in the West don't have or want.
But we got cheatgrass.
Yeah, we'll give you.
You got cheatgrass. That's right.
We got cheatgrass on the Deuce Head.
but really trying to, how can we better utilize our forests to produce a diverse amount of forest products for the nation at the same time, managing them for a diverse amount of species. Jeff mentioned, a lot of these 12,000 at-risk species, well, if you're a hunter or an angler, you probably say, well, why do I care about that? You should care about that, because when we start having where, the regulatory arm of the Endangered Species Act starts to dictate how we, where you have, politicians or judges starting to tell you how we are to manage, our public lands, the species we care about always don't turn out on the good side there. So we want to keep where we are, putting a lot of focus on active forest management to benefit species. Just a good example, like in recommendation 5, that has a lot to do with the Farm Bill. And you've seen a tremendous amount of dollars going toward wetland conservation. When you look at wetland species, because of that habitat work that's gone on, they're doing pretty good. But where we've not been spending money and doing good habitat work, those populations are declining, and we've got to reverse that at a time where we can do something about it, and it doesn't spiral to a population level that is going to be very hard to turn around.
So let me just give a quick on that. Mule deer, we've talked about how active forest management help mule deer. They help elk in the West. To be able to get the groceries on the ground, like James just talked about, to be able to open up some cover to improve aspen stands, to restore sagebrush habitats. So here in the West, we have those things that we care about, but other species that people know and recognize: ruffed grouse, woodcock, bobwhite quail. All of them need early successional habitat or mixed successional with a mosaic. And those are all kind of biological terms. But basically, that means they need some places where there's older timber, but they need some of those young, gnarly meadow habitats with saplings growing up. Being able to actively management habitat is good for the areas, the surrounding areas, for forage, for vegetation, for eliminating invasive species, but it's also helping some of these species that we love. And for those of us who aren't always looking at the game species, there's a whole bunch of warblers and New England cottontail and so many other things that also benefit from habitat management. We can't just let it lie. That doesn't work. We need to make sure that we have the mix of habitats that so many different species need and want.
Jodi, going back to the ecological training and wildlife management training that we all had, as undergrads, is that umbrella species sort of approach that can you use something that is fairly tangible to manage for and provide benefits to a lot of other species. And, whether the last few years, greater sage grouse has been, a rallying cry, rightfully so, because of where their populations are at. And, we think that some of the game species can provide that. And we need to do a lot better job at really telling the public and telling the people that you're not just getting more deer, more elk, more game species. You're getting a lot of other things. And, this integrated management approach where we look at landscapes and we look at watersheds is really where I think the game is going to be at. Miles often refers to as random acts of conservation, and I often call small things postage stamp conservation. Those are all great, but if we can start linking that stuff together and putting things, as you've all heard me say, the maximum impact that we can have with our efforts at MDF, we're going to benefit butterflies, and we're going to benefit all these other species out there that need some active management because things have gotten out of whack. And, from a Mule Deer Foundation's perspective, we also represent black-tailed deer. And when you look at the forest needs for black-tailed deer, whether it's the species found in Alaska, the Sitka black-tailed deer, or the Columbian black-tailed deer in the lower 48, that behooves us to go in and do more. The stuff we've looked at in Southeast Alaska where, the big logging contracts of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, now those second growth have grown up. They get to a stage called stem exclusion, which means there's no sunlight hitting the ground. And so if you don't open it up, like James said, to get those groceries on the ground, you're going to be affecting deer species, their populations, their distributions, and a whole lot of other things. And so those are the things we look at. That's the approach we've been trying to take with not just our stewardship program, but really trying to swing all of our efforts to be, something that has real tangible benefits and moves towards positive outcomes rather than outputs. It's not just that we treat so many acres a year or fix so many miles of fence, but there's a response with those species and the wildlife and the habitat that we're trying to positively impact.
Absolutely. So you also mentioned, Steve, earlier, and James, you mentioned it as well. One of the recommendations has to do with private lands conservation. We've talked an awful lot about public lands. Obviously, the bill we're looking at today which is in my screen, just cracked the 300 mark, 300 to 105. And that to me, I'm feeling a little verklempt if we want to go back to an old Saturday Night Live reference. But seriously, that is simply remarkable to watch that happening right now. That's amazing. Private land conservation clearly a lot of the best habitat is on private lands, and private landowners are some of the best stewards of the lands that they own. So Farm Bill conservation programs, conservation easements, these are other parts of what was recommended within the overall recommendation 5, the actions that were included there. Private land conservation is super important as well. Either any of you guys want to take up that mantle?
Sure, I'll say a few comments on that, Jodi. If you look at private land conservation and what private lands, they make up a huge percentage of habitat that we have in this country. It's not, wildlife don't just live on a national forest or a national wildlife refuge. And a lot of people don't know that the Farm Bill is the single largest source of funding for conservation, not only just in private lands, but it's the single largest source of funding for conservation in the nation. This is about $6 billion a year in annual funding. And today we're talking about a total of 9. So just that puts it a little bit in context. You've got a number of different programs. We work a lot with the Wetland Reserve Program. Here in the lower Mississippi Valley, it's restored about 1 million acres of bottomland hardwoods back into habitat. And quite frankly, one of the things that it's done that's pretty impressive is it contributed to the delisting of the Louisiana black bear. So we don't have any regulatory issues because of that delisting as we work toward managing these bottomland hardwood systems in the lower Mississippi Valley. That program is an easement program. You have another component of that has to do with agricultural and grasslands in terms of easements. You have also a big component in terms of working lands within the Farm Bill. Much of that is in the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. One of the things that American Wildlife Conservation Partners took the lead on several years ago was they conceptualized and pushed through Congress the Wildlife Habitat Incentives Program. Now that's been merged into the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. 10% of the funding of that every year goes back into either restoring or enhancing wildlife habitat. So that's a good example of what AWCP has done that's resulted in real acres for fish and wildlife on the ground there. CRP is the Conservation Reserve Program is another one that's been a big champion between Delta Waterfowl Foundation, Ducks Unlimited, and Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever. They've been some of the large backers of those. The voluntary public access is another one that AWCP has taken the lead on and has resulted in lands being able to made public for hunters and anglers that are private lands. So just a couple examples there of what AWCP has done in terms of Farm Bill. We have recommendations on how to strengthen some of those provisions and make those better as we start moving into authorizing a new Farm Bill here in the next 18 months.
So, and just to do an MDF shout out there, the Voluntary Public Habitat and Access and Habitat Incentive Program, VPA HIP, which is the acronym people use, that funds a number of state-based walk-in access programs, of which one is the PLOTS program, Private Lands Open to Sportsmen in North Dakota. And Mule Deer Foundation, I'm going to shout out to Marshall Johnson there in North Dakota. That is a program that we've gotten involved with, working with a private landowner to do some restoration and to remove fence and improve habitat there. And that's opening up some of that private land for open to sportsmen, and some of that funding comes through this program. And They are gaveling the final vote count, guys. 310 to 107.
Good. Jodi, just real quick before, what a lot of people, we talk a lot about public lands, and this bill today is mostly is public land. But wildlife spend a lot of time in the West on private lands, and we can't forget about that. And one of the things migration corridor studies and the GPS collars have showed us is mule deer, elk, and antelope all go a lot of the year on private land. And so we can't forget that, how important they are.
Absolutely.
All right, Jodi. We're done.
We are done. Round of applause. Hey, come on, give us your funnel noise meter. Come on. Folks, I cannot, and I'm going to let everybody make a final statement, but this is a huge victory for all of us. I'm so excited to see this happen in my life and my career, to see a success on something I started on so many years ago. This is attributable in large part to the work of groups like AWCP. Thank you for listening in. I'm going to pass it around to everybody else to give their own closing thoughts.
Go ahead, James.
I'd just like to especially thank the Congressional Sportsmen Foundation and Mule Deer Foundation thanks to y'all for hosting us today, and for all y'all's good work on making sure that we had 75% of the vote. And I've got one question for Miles. Do you really think I have an accent?
Yeah.
You think we have an accent?
Yeah.
That's what I always thought.
Yeah. Well, hey, James, I thank you. And not only are you a great friend, you're a great conservationist, and you work tirelessly on this stuff that we talk about, and a lot of people don't see all the work that you do. And thank you for everything that you do. And I'm glad you're a partner of MDF, but also glad that you're a friend and a fellow Boone and Crockett member. So thank you. And
it's a team effort. I'm also a member of MDF.
That's right. You are. And you remind me of that every time I see you, because I usually have to buy you a drink. So, no.
And we appreciate that greatly. And if you aren't already,
yes, I'll take the last word, Jodi.
Yep, absolutely.
To everyone out there that helped get this historic day and make it happen, thank you. Those that worked on this, like our guest today and Jodi, those that called, those that support the groups that worked on this, thank you, thank you, thank you. I think this is going to have generational impacts in the positive way for conservation. If you have not reached out to your member, to your conservation organizations that you belong, please reach out, thank them, call your senators, call your congressman or woman, and thank them for doing this. Join groups like the Mule Deer Foundation. We need your support. We want to know what you think, and we need you to be involved to keep this going, and so that we can continue to have historic days like today, and we can continue to get things good done for mule deer, black-tailed deer, and all other wildlife. And so with that, this is Steve Belinda, and thank you for Talking Mule Deer.
Thanks for Talking Mule Deer with Steve Belinda and Jodi Stemler. The Mule Deer Foundation is the only conservation group in North America dedicated to restoring, improving, and protecting mule deer and black-tailed deer and their habitat. MDF is a strong voice for hunters in access, wildlife management, and conservation policy issues. To find out more, visit www.muledeer.org and stay tuned for the next episode of Talkin' Mule Deer.